Well, thank you very much, Daniele. Welcome to you all. It is a great honor for me to have Bill Nordhaus opening this Venice International Conference on Climate Change. Obviously, Professor Nordhaus needs no introduction, especially to the people who are here today, and there is certainly not enough time to list all his many academic achievements. But please indulge me in sharing with you a couple of personal memories about his work. In the early 1970s, I was studying for my PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, and I came to know an influential NBR paper that Bill Nordhaus wrote with Jim Tobin on whether GMP, at the time we used this gross national product, now we talk about GDP, and considering whether that was an obsolete measure of economic progress. Only a few years had passed since Bob Kennedy had famously asserted that GDP measures almost everything except those which make life worthwhile. But Nordhaus and Tobin really accurately examined several corrections, taking into account non-market activities, the environmental pollution and others, and other leisure and other items that are not normally measured and accounted for in GNP or GDP. And they concluded at the end that GNP, albeit imperfect, still provided a relevant picture of the way the economy performs and of economic growth. And the conclusion that most, I think, economists today would subscribe, certainly policymakers. Now, during the same years, Professor Nordhaus recognized early on the weaknesses of a report that was commissioned by the Club of Rome. I remember that because I was distributing this report in Rome just after my graduation in 71, 72. And it was interesting because the limits to growth, that was the report, pointed out the flaws of gloomy scenarios. Pointed out that there were risks that, unless it was corrected, a gloomy scenario would have taken place. A scenario which predicted an imminent depletion of natural resources. Nordhaus observed rather correctly that this depletion was largely based on the extrapolation of the trends. They were engineers. They were basically putting together trends and trying to understand whether limits would have been reached under this extrapolation. But they did not take sufficiently in consideration the role of markets, the rebalancing power of prices, the servo mechanisms, and the nature of technological change that takes place endogenously, often as a response to market failures. And in particular, when the resources used in production became scarcer, an increase in prices discourages demand. Higher prices subsequently provide an incentive to develop new production methods that utilize less of these resources. A few years later, Professor Nordhaus, however, understood, perhaps much earlier than others, that indeed there are limits to economic growth. But these limits arise not much, perhaps not only from depletion of natural resources, but mostly from the limited capacity of the atmosphere to absorb the greenhouse gases generated by human activities. And in 1992, we provided all of us with an important quantitative tool, which was called the DICE, the Dynamic Integrated Climate Economy Model, that compared benefits of action against climate change with the costs of inaction. In his recent Nobel Prize lecture, Professor Nordhaus convincingly argued that climate change is a particularly thorny externality due to its global nature. And this puts it outside the domain not only of markets, but also of national governments. It is really a global problem. And so we wonder today how the global community can overcome this environmental standoff. It is a challenge that calls for coordinated action across countries, and this is the main reason why we, this year, have put the fight against climate change at the center of our G20 presidency. To conclude, in the last few years, there have been proposals by Professor Nordhaus, some really thought-provoking response to the challenge of climate change with the establishment of a climate club in which somehow those who do not belong to the club may have to pay and therefore there's an incentive to join the club to avoid trade penalties. It is obviously a proposal that has several technical, economic, geopolitical difficulties, but the issue really is without a mechanism like this or similar tools, there may be free riding in the reduction of carbon emissions. People, countries will wait for others to act, and if in waiting nobody most likely acts. So the issue is what kind of pragmatic way forward do we have or we may design to arrest climate change. Professor Nordhaus will help us to keep this debate open, avoiding any hasty, I hope, dismissal of potentially useful policies. So I would close expressing my hope that the G20 will contribute to fostering a broad agreement on the necessary steps, and that the next COP26 in Glasgow will succeed in transforming good intentions, like the ones we have today, into concrete actions. And let us now hear from Professor Nordhaus himself. I'm very grateful for you having accepted to be here today with us. Thank you, please.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here in this beautiful spot. Many of you who've been here have heard people remark on the beauty and the history of Venice, and I'd just like to give you my own view of it. Venice flies, if you're in Venice, you fly under 3 flags. The first flag is the flag of Venice. And Venice, among many things, is remarkable as having the longest lived democracy of any major polity in the world. The democracy in Venice, until it was interrupted by Napoleon, lived 500 years. And that's a worthy achievement. The second flag we fly under here when we're in Venice is the flag of Italy. And the flag of Italy is important for many things, but for what we're doing today, it's important because Italy was the home of the first universities. And although universities in the early days were perhaps not what they are today, universities have evolved into institutions of independent thinking, of science, social, natural, as well as humanities. And the reason that we have the kinds of knowledge about scientific and economic affairs that we do today is because of the rise of these great universities. And the final flag in Venice is the flag of the EU. And the EU is also another important institution, as really the major multinational institution today with power over many nations. And all 3 of those are put together because those are an inspiration for the kinds of policies and thinking we need as we go forward to deal with climate change. What I'd like to do today is talk about 4 issues. The first one is what I'll call the state of the world in terms of climate change policy. And all I'll do is show you a little on that there's been basically no improvement in in emissions over the last 3 decades. For all the talk and all the COPs and all the conferences of the parties, we've made very, very little progress in reducing the trend of emissions. I'll show you that first. Then you ask, why is that? And there are really 3 reasons. One is that a key ingredient in reducing emissions is high carbon prices. High prices on CO2 emissions. While it's true that in the EU you have a relatively high prices on CO2 emissions, it only covers part of the economy, and it only covers a very small part of the world. So globally, prices are still very low. Secondly, we suffer from inadequate investment in low-carbon technologies because of the externalities there. So there's a kind of another externality in addition to the climate externality, which is the knowledge externality. And finally, Ignacio mentioned at the end, our chair, the problem of free riding, and that countries are free riding on the actions of others, and because of the free riding, that has undermined our climate agreements. So those are the 3 points that I'd like to, one is an overview point about where we stand, and the other 3 is about the policies that are necessary and ones on which we're falling short. This is the first figure I'll show you, and this basically shows what's happened with respect to decarbonization since 1990 through 2019. I go through 2019 because that's the last year when we have data that looks reliable. After that, the pandemic has mucked up all the data. And so what this shows is what's the carbon intensity of global production. That's to say CO2 emissions, industrial CO2 emissions, divided by global real GDP. And you can see there's a straight line there, which is the red line, which is declining at 1.8% per year. And then you have the dotted blue line, which shows the actual numbers, the actual intensity. This excludes China because China is so big and has had such different trends that it tends to distort the aggregate data. And what you can see from this is there's been basically no break in the trend over the last 30 years. So even with the agreements of Kyoto, going back to the Framework Convention in the early 1990s, the Kyoto Treaty in 1997, the Copenhagen Accord, the Paris Accord, you can see virtually no change in the trend of decarbonization. That trend line would have to turn very, very sharply down if we were going to meet our objectives. I'll show those in a second, but I would like to emphasize that this trend, accompanied with 3 or 4% GDP growth, means that CO2 emissions are rising. But this is the key trend to look at if you want to know the effectiveness of policies. Now the next, so this is the first and key item that I'd like to talk about. I'll talk about the reasons for this in a minute, but this is the key thing that you need to take into account when you look at how far our various conferences of the parties and the way we've gone up to date, how well they have worked. Now, the key point I'd like to next point is that policies are inadequate for our international objectives. And to do this, I'll show you, I'm sorry, I need to go back. I'll show you the emissions going back to 2015 and the latest through 2019, and then the projections according to climate modelers of emissions, CO2 emissions going forward. So emissions in 2019 were around 53 or 54 billion tons of CO2 equivalent per year. This includes non-CO2 gases as well. And with current policies, that's to say virtually no policies, as I'll talk about later, that will grow slowly 1 or 2% per year over the coming decades. Will not turn down, but will continue to grow according to current projections. Current policy that has been agreed upon in the Paris Accord has national policies. These are voluntary policies, but they're policies that countries, virtually all countries, have agreed to. And in the middle line there, in the blue line, it shows through 2030 what countries have actually agreed to. And then after 2030, assuming the same degree of tightening. But we don't need to go beyond 2030 to get the major point, which is that even with the Paris Accord, and this is assuming countries meet their obligations under the Paris Accord, there will be basically emissions will basically be flat over the next 20 years. There will be very, very little improvement in emissions if countries meet their obligations under the Paris Accord. The final line at the bottom there shows you a run that estimates what emissions would need to be if we were to meet the international target of 2 degrees C. And that would have this is one that meets it efficiently. It's not the only one, but it's one that meets it in a way that's cost effective at minimum cost. And that would involve a sharp decline in emissions. And if you look, you can see around 2050, it gets to 0 net emissions of CO2 equivalent. This is global emissions, including non-CO2 greenhouse gases. But the main point is that that would involve a very sharp and steep drop in emissions and emissions intensity to reach the 2-degree target. As you can see, even if countries meet the Paris Accord, they will be only a fraction of the way to meeting the international objectives, and there are also questions about whether those will be met. So there are 3 policy issues that need to be discussed. There are 3 ingredients to meeting our objectives. One is carbon pricing, the other is technology, and the third is international agreements. So let's start with carbon prices. It's been well known for many years that high prices on CO2 emissions is a key, and really a necessary ingredient in carbon policy. It's not sufficient, but it is necessary. And it's a key to sharp emissions reductions. A second point, which is not quite so obvious, is that the level of price, of the carbon price, of the emissions price, needs to be harmonized to meet the objectives. By harmonization, I mean harmonized across countries. We could say equalized if you like, but harmonized is a less ambitious goal, and also needs to be harmonized across sectors. So you can't have some sectors, say motor fuels, with very, very high carbon prices, and other sectors, such as electricity generation, with very low carbon prices. So a key ingredient is that the level of price should be harmonized across countries and should be high. But the fact, as I'll show you in a minute, is that prices, carbon prices, emission prices, and the regimes under which they operate, the structures under which they operate, are highly fragmented. If you were to reach the target of 2 degrees C, that would require a uniform, or at least average price, effective price, somewhere between $50 and $150 per ton of CO2. But if you look at the calculations of the actual carbon price that have been prepared by the World Bank, the average carbon price in 2019 was about $2 per ton of CO2. So 2 instead of 50 to 100. So that shows one reason why policies have been so ineffective is because carbon prices are so low. I show you next a picture of what I call the carbon price landscape from the World Bank. This is from the World Bank report, and it's a kind of collage. It's a collage of policies of different countries. And what it shows on the horizontal axis, there are 2 things it shows. On the horizontal axis, it shows the share of emissions that are covered by a regime. And on the vertical axis, it shows the carbon price of the regime. So you look, there's the large green bubble in the middle, the lower middle. That's the European Trading Scheme, which is the largest trade and also multinational trading scheme. And it covers, there are two things about it that you note. It's very large, or a third, I guess. But one is that the price is relatively low. It's been as low as $5 and as high as $50 a ton. But in this period, it was a little under $20 a ton. But more important is it only covers a fraction of the economy, less than half of the European economy. So you can see other, if you can see that, you can see other countries around the world. You can see on the right, there are countries with there are regions. The right dot there is has a very high coverage rate and a very low tax. That's the Quebec cap and trade and the California cap and trade. And then off the map, it isn't really shown, you have Sweden and Switzerland with very high prices but very low coverage. Just to be clear, if you were, I'm going to superimpose on this what you would need. That pink dot there shows you what you'd need to meet your objectives. You need 100% coverage, and you need a very high price. Right? You'd need all the countries to have 100% coverage or nearly 100% coverage, and you'd also need a very high price. And you can see in the background there what reality is, that none of the countries have high prices and 100% coverage. And again, this only shows the countries with coverage, and 80% of the emissions are actually at 0, countries like the United States and other countries. So the point here, I would just emphasize, is that carbon prices are a key to climate change policy, but they're fragmented and they're low. So a second policy area is one that's necessary, perhaps not emphasized so much because people have focused on carbon prices, but in a way just as important. To reach our objectives, we're going to have a major technological transformation in the energy sector. We're going to have to replace many of the technologies that we now use with new technologies. But just as there's a climate externality, there's also a technological externality, because the public returns on green innovation are much larger than the private returns on green innovation. There's a double externality here, because there's already a gap between the public and private returns to innovation, because the inventors only get a small fraction of the returns. But in addition to that, the fact that the returns are underpriced because carbon emissions are underpriced lead to a double externality. So this means there's inadequate research and development in green technologies. And you can use as examples carbon capture and sequestration, for which there's basically no economic incentive to undertake it now. Advanced nuclear, which is already extremely expensive and does not have any advantage over fossil fuels because of low carbon prices. And hydrogen usage in various sectors, and hydrogen technology, which is also currently very expensive, needs vast expenses of R&D and subsidies of R&D, but won't get it as long as there's no carbon pricing and no incentives. So the policies here are two. One is that you can already improve the incentives by carbon pricing. If you have high carbon prices, then already green technologies and low carbon technologies will have an advantage that they don't have now. So carbon pricing is not just an incentive in terms of trying to get people to reduce their use, but it's also just as important an incentive inducing innovation in low carbon technologies. And in addition to that, we need enhanced incentives at the level of our governments, our fiscal incentives and intellectual property incentives for low carbon technologies. I will just give you one example of misplaced priorities in our governmental research budgets, and that is the misplaced priority in the U.S. federal R&D, research and development. I might have asked you whether you thought we spend more on energy R&D or defense R&D. I've asked this before, and people usually don't know. But the fact is, as you can see here, there's a vast misplaced priority in terms of federal research and development. Weapons and nuclear weapons and security, and this was back in 2018 budget, had almost $60 billion of federal research and development, whereas advanced energy and renewables had only $2 billion. And that has not changed very much since 2018. The real priority is we need to get that right bar way up. We need to increase dramatically in all of our technologically advanced countries the investment in green technologies. And these are federal subsidies, federal research and development tax credits, and other elements. Final point I'd like to make is the problem of free riding and how free riding undermines international climate agreements. I think it's a painful realization, but I think we need to face that our international climate policy, the approach we're taking, is at a dead end. We've gone through all these 26 conferences of the parties, and we're still with voluntary agreements. And voluntary agreements are hampered by free riding. All of our climate agreements to date, back to the Framework Convention, through the Kyoto Protocol, through the Paris Accord, are voluntary. Countries agree to take steps, but there are no penalties if they don't take the steps. Under the Kyoto Protocol, when the US withdrew, there were no penalties. When Canada withdrew, there were no penalties. There are no penalties for non-participation, and there are no penalties for not meeting your goals. Now, you might say, what's the problem with that? Well, the problem with that is that countries under this free riding possibility will fail to reduce emissions or fail to keep commitments to reduce emissions in a costly fashion. And for those of you who have been involved in other areas, it's very similar to the race to the bottom in global corporate taxation, where we've seen the very sharp reduction in corporate taxes as companies race to the tax shelters. And it's a very similar kind of problem trying to face it, that there's a kind of free rider problem as long as there's no incentives and there's no penalties for countries not to reduce their corporate tax. So one proposal, which was mentioned earlier, is what I've called a climate club to overcome free riding. And what we see as we look at the history of international agreements, such as the World Trade Organization, is that effective agreements require incentives. They require carrots and sticks. They require countries to make promises, to make commitments, but they also require consequences if they don't keep their commitments. And this is the same thing that we need with a climate treaty, which we don't have with any of the current climate treaties or the current proposals. And here's just an example. You can think of others, but this is one that we have studied and modeled, been modeled in different places, Yale and other universities. You might start with a target price, which is the obligation of countries is that they have a minimum domestic carbon price. They can meet whichever way they want, cap and trade or carbon tax, but they have to meet a minimum carbon price, rising over time. And then there's a penalty on non-participants and people who don't meet the obligations of something like a penalty tariff. And for these examples, I've used a uniform tariff, which is much simpler to administer than a countervailing duty. The modeling we've done at Yale and at other universities suggests that this approach, this very approach of a minimum carbon price of, say, $50 a ton or $100 a ton, and I'll say a modest uniform penalty on non-participants of 3 to 5% would actually induce participation, widespread participation, by different countries. So if I can summarize then, just to come back to the 4 points I started with, there's been very little progress on slowing warming. There's been lots of policies and lots of steps and lots of conferences, but if you look at the proof of the pudding, as they say, if you look at the actual key element, which is emissions, emissions intensity has declined at about the same rate over the last 10 years as it did the 10 years before that and the 10 years before that. We need to see a downturn in that decarbonization, and we have not seen it to date. A first central goal of policy needs to be high and harmonized carbon prices, and this would be high prices starting at least at $50 a ton, perhaps rising sharply after that, harmonized across countries and across sectors. One of the elements, third point, one of the elements that's been underemphasized is the importance of low carbon technologies and the fact that there's underinvestment in those, partly because of low carbon prices, partly because the governments have not put the kind of support into those sectors that are needed given its priority. And finally, effective international policies require some kind of club structure, some kind of structure where you have carrots and sticks along with carrots, I should say, where you have incentives for countries to participate. So countries participate because it's in their interest to participate, not because they're being lectured to participate or being cajoled or coerced to participate. So a club type of structure would be approach to that. Thank you very much.